Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tony Monaco, president of Tufts University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Russell Lecture on Spiritual Life. The Russell Lectureship is one of Tufts' most long-standing traditions. Established by James Russell in 1867, it is one of the oldest lectureships at Tufts, occurring nearly every year since it was first held in 1868. It is rare that we cancel a lecture on any given year, but as we all know far too well, 2020 was unlike any other year in recent memory. I want to take a moment to thank the University Chaplaincy for their hard work to continue this great tradition and for making a virtual Russell Lecture possible this year. This past year, we've been met with many unprecedented challenges. Not only has the pandemic upended our daily lives, but a number of recent events fueled by bigotry, systemic racism, and anti-Semitism have sought to further harm and divide our nation. During these difficult times, we have found numerous occasions to come together as a Tufts community to reflect, heal, and focus on what unites us rather than what divides us. The lecture today invites us to reflect on the spiritual aspects of these critical issues and to consider ways in which we can work together, regardless of religious or spiritual belief, towards a more just and inclusive nation. These values of justice and inclusivity form the backbone of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a vision for a beloved community. And it is a vision that we strive to achieve in our own Tufts community as well. I now turn the event over to our university chaplain, Elyse Nelson-Winger, to introduce our guest speaker for the afternoon, Reverend Adam Russell Taylor. Thank you.
Thank you, President Monaco, and greetings and peace, students, faculty, staff, alumni, community members, and friends, to Tufts' annual Russell Lecture on Spiritual Life. I and the entire multi-faith University Chaplaincy team welcome you and our distinguished speaker, Reverend Adam Russell Taylor, whose work and ministry testify to the transforming, critically, intellectually, spiritually, radically rooted faith committed to living the questions and callings of social justice in our time. I arrived at Tufts last October and immediately joined vital conversations related to our shared work in becoming an anti-racist institution. At the same time, I was reading Sojourners magazine and following Reverend Taylor's columns replete with faithful calls for justice for Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, for voting rights, for faith communities, pastoral and prophetic civic engagement in our society. And I thought, if we could invite Reverend Taylor to speak for this lecture in this moment, we would be fortunate indeed. I am delighted he accepted the invitation. And if the conversation earlier this afternoon with student chaplains as Mira Hamuri Davis and Walker Bristol is dedication, this time will enrich and challenge us all. Reverend Adam Russell Taylor is president of Sojourners, a nonprofit organization committed to faith in action for social justice. Reverend Taylor previously led the Faith Initiative at the World Bank Group and served as the vice president in charge of advocacy at World Vision US and the senior political director at Sojourners. He was selected for the 2009-2010 class of White House Fellows and served in the White House Office of Cabinet Affairs and Public Engagement. Reverend Taylor is a graduate of Emory University, the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology. He is the author of the book, Mobilizing Hope, Faith-Inspired Activism for a Post-Civil Rights Generation. Taylor is ordained in the American Baptist Church and the Progressive National Baptist Convention and serves in ministry at the Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. Today's titled The Work Ahead, Building a Just, Beloved Community, Welcome, Reverend.
Thank you, Elyse. So grateful to be with you, and certainly wish that it could be in person. It'll have to be virtual this time around, but certainly would welcome an opportunity to spend some time with you in person when that is possible again. I think we all are getting used to virtual events. As a speaker and a preacher, I certainly yearn to be together with people in person. It is not easy to speak virtually, but I'm going to do my best to bring the same kind of passion and engagement as I usually try to, at least. But I really do miss not being able to see your reactions and be able to make this more interactive. But fortunately, we're going to have some of that time during the question and answer period. I want to thank President Monaco for the kind words and inspiring words about the beloved community, which I'm going to reflect much more upon in the course of this lecture. And I want to thank all the students that I had a chance to just meet with and others that helped make this invitation possible. Can't tell you how honored I am to be a part of this long and auspicious history of the Russell Lecture. And it's particularly special to me because, as you just heard, my middle name is Russell. I got my middle name from my grandfather, my mother's father, Russell Lawson. And even though I never had the privilege of meeting him because he died before I was born, I feel like his activism and his spirit and commitment to justice is something that I have been inspired by. And so I am particularly honored to be able to give this year's Russell Lecture. I am a Baptist preacher, and we often use more than one title, so I will be reflecting on the theme of the work ahead, building a just, beloved community. But I want to tag an additional title on this talk, which is 5 Smooth Stones to Build the Beloved Community. I want to just mention really quickly another word about Sojourners. We are, as you heard, a Christian peace and justice organization that has been around for almost 50 years. And we have an online publication called Sojo Mail that is available for free. And so if you just go to our website at www.sojo.net, you can learn a lot more about us, read some of our articles, and also sign up for our free e-newsletter. Also welcome you to be a subscriber to our magazine or to join any of our campaigns that's working on a whole range of social justice issues and causes, from climate justice to immigration to criminal justice and racialized policing to poverty and much more. I want to give one kind of caveat as I begin. I am going to be drawing on my own Christian faith in this talk the most. But I want to emphasize from the outset that faith does not have a monopoly on morality in this nation. And the process of building the beloved community is one that involves and includes everyone, people of every faith or of no faith at all. All of us are vital to this conversation and project. And so I really welcome everyone in. And again, I'll be kind of sharing a little bit more from my own faith tradition, but also touching on some other faith traditions as well. This year, Easter happened to fall on April 4th, the same date of Dr. King's tragic assassination 92 years ago. He would have been 92 had he lived up until this year. But it fell on the anniversary of Dr. King's tragic assassination while he was organizing sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, who were fighting for a living wage, a cause that is still very relevant in our time over 50 years later. Dr. King is most well known for his speeches and his books, but oftentimes his sermons get overlooked. And Dr. King used to describe himself and say, first and foremost, I am a Black Baptist preacher. And so I think it's important sometimes to draw from the rich sermons that so characterized who he was and what he had to share with our nation. There's a book I'd highly recommend called Strength to Love that's a compilation of his sermons. And one of the sermons in that book is where I want to start. It is actually literally the kind of foundation for the book, my first book, Mobilizing Hope, that really framed the book and in some ways inspired the book in the first place. In a sermon, Dr. King essentially does a remix of Romans 12, the Apostle Paul's words where he said, do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And in Dr. King's sanctified imagination, he provides a version that says the saving of our world from pending doom will come not through the complacent adjustment of a conforming majority, but through the creative maladjustment of a non-conforming minority. Now, it's kind of a mouthful, but I really love this quote because Dr. King combines two what I think are critical concepts that are desperately needed in today's world and in our nation today. First, a commitment to be creatively maladjusted to the world around us, particularly to be maladjusted to aspects of the status quo that so often harm and hurt certain people. And to not just be content with having a different mindset or a different attitude, in this case, an anti-racist mindset, an anti-racist attitude, but to also be willing to confront and get in the way of injustice, as Congressman John Lewis so often did and described it, that to get into what he described as good trouble. And that requires being a transformed nonconformist. This dual call is desperately needed in the times in which we live today, when we are confronted with the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and a much longer standing pandemic of systemic racism that has haunted our country from its very inception. I believe that Dr. King pushes us to understand that part and parcel to spirituality and faith is a commitment to activism, a commitment to help make the world and our nation and our communities a better place, and a commitment to address many of the root causes of injustice that so often perpetuate harm and perpetuate oppression and injustice in the first place. I grew up believing that I was born in the wrong era. I was born in 1976. I will age myself here. And my parents instilled in me just a deep and abiding belief that my generation, Generation X, inherited the unfinished business of the civil rights struggle. My parents made the controversial decision to marry each other in 1968. My mother is Black and my father is white. And an interracial marriage at that moment had only recently been legalized across the country in 1967 through a Supreme Court case called Loving versus the state of Virginia that then made interracial marriage legalized across the country. My parents met in a PhD program in Ohio and ended up starting a life together in a relatively small city north of Seattle, Washington, called Bellingham, Washington. And they started life there because they felt like Bellingham was a place that was fairly tolerant and open, and a place where they could raise a family where racism wouldn't be the dominant factor in their lives. But pretty quickly, I became quite infatuated with the civil rights struggle and started to read as much as I could get my hands on about that movement. I started to realize just how essential the leadership of the Black church was in the movement, but also realized how many other faith leaders, rabbis and imams and people of conscience, how essential their activism was as well in the context of the movement. And I became particularly impressed and moved by the role of students through the student arm of the civil rights movement called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Leaders like Diane Nash and James Bevel and of course John Lewis, who were like the foot soldiers of the movement that often conflicted sometimes with the SELC and some of the more mainstream parts of the movement, including the NAACP and others, but we're willing to kind of push the envelope and be on the vanguard of social and political change, to force this country to live up to the full meaning of its creed of liberty and justice for all. As I looked around across my generation, I often felt a certain degree of frustration because I saw that many in my generation, certainly not all, but many had taken for granted the struggles that came before us and had started to replace a commitment to civic activism, particularly in the context of addressing so much of the unfinished business of the civil rights struggle, from economic justice to later mass incarceration, which was just taking off as I was coming of age, to racialized policing and police violence, among other components of what I would describe as that unfinished business. And instead of kind of engaging in civic activism, they were replacing that with community service. Now, don't get it twisted. I am a huge believer in community service. I'm actually part of the same fraternity as Dr. Martin Luther King, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And we have a proud motto that says, first of all, service to all, we shall transcend all. But community service, while an essential part of how we express our spirituality and faith, is fundamentally different than a commitment to justice. Justice requires getting to the root causes of what is causing pain and causing suffering and causing inequality. Dr. King and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and so many other leaders of the civil rights movement understood that no amount of service was going to tear down the system of Jim Crow segregation that prevented Blacks from being able to attend the same schools or drink from the same drinking fountains or board the bus and sit in the same seats, let alone that barred Blacks from being able to exercise their fundamental right to vote in the South and other parts of the country. And so this kind of recognition that at its core, justice does require a change of attitudes, a change of behavior, but it also requires a change in law and systems and policies. It requires systemic and structural change. And so often we can reduce justice to a philanthropic or charitable enterprise, which does a disservice to what needs to happen in order to transform our society. From a faith perspective, I think one of the reasons why justice gets so misappropriated is that we have become overly influenced by what I would describe as a pathological individualism. Individualism is ingrained in the American ethos, in the American identity. While certainly there are some benefits to kind of a rugged individualism, taken to an extreme, and particularly when that gets infused in our understanding of theology and of faith, it can have very destructive consequences. It can cause us to reduce our faith to simply a personal enterprise that has no real bearing or impact on the communities around us, or in a larger sense, our nation and our world. It can lead us to seeing, at least in the Christian context, our faith as kind of fire insurance from hell, as this possession that keeps me from going to hell and enables me to go to heaven, rather than seeing our faith as something that enlists us in God's kingdom building purposes in the world. When I was coming of age, there was a theology that I would argue was a very misguided theology called the prosperity gospel. I used to refer to it as the bling bling gospel, that overly reduced a faith as a kind of transactional thing about what we can get from God, rather than an emphasis on how we can be in relationship with God, and that relationship inspires us to go out and change the world. And again, I would argue that faith at its best does that inspiration to then equip and enable us to go out and change the world. When I was a student at Emory University as an undergrad, I yearned for our own equivalent to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That was decades before the Black Lives Matter movement was birthed by 3 Black women after the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2013 and the acquittal of George Zimmerman for his killing. Far too many of my generation had grown cynical about politics and did not necessarily believe that political activism could lead to significant change. Well, I spent my early career trying to make that case and was engaged in a number of different causes, particularly internationally, that showed me just how powerful we can be when we put our faith into action and we engage in civic activism itself. Certainly, Dr. King and so many other civil rights leaders also understood that faith combined with civic activism could literally be the spark plug, the catalyst for building social movements that could literally transform our nation. When we compare the dark days of Jim Crow segregation to today, it is true that we have come a long way. The hard-fought victories of the civil rights movement paved the way for a series of firsts. I'm very proud that my mother became the first Black woman to serve as the vice president at the University of Arizona. In 2008, we witnessed the election of our nation's first Black president, something that my parents and many in their generation never thought they would see happen. Just a few months ago, we proudly saw the first woman of African and South Asian descent, Kamala Harris, become the first woman vice president of the United States. But we can't simply define our racial progress or hail that progress around these victories while ignoring so much of the ongoing racial pain and injustice that is in our midst. And when we look out the landscape of America today, Dr. King's dream is so often being derailed and deferred. When more than 1 in 4 Black children grow up in the quicksand of poverty, dreams are being deferred. When less than half of African Americans graduate from high school compared to 78% of whites, dreams are being deferred. When Black joblessness is twice that of whites and Black wealth is 1/10 of that of whites, dreams are being deferred. When 1 in 3 Black men are currently under the control of the criminal justice system, either in prison, in jail, or on parole, dreams, my brothers and sisters, are being deferred. When Asian Americans are being victimized by racist crimes and violence in the context of COVID, most recently and horrifically at a number of spas in Atlanta, dreams are being deferred. And when Black and brown Americans are 2 to 3 times more likely to contract and die of COVID-19, we know that dreams are being deferred. Yes, beloved, we are living in some trying and turbulent times. And we are also living in one of the most divided times, the most polarized times in our nation's history. We are experiencing a degree of polarization that we have not seen since the 1960s. It's what the magazine The Atlantic refers to as a cold civil war. As a nation, we experienced one of the most dangerous and alarming moments in our history when rioters and insurrectionists laid siege to the US Capitol, seeking to overturn the 2020 election results on January 6th. This violent insurrection was fueled by the flames of a big lie that the former president promulgated with many enablers, that the last election was stolen, and that was undergirded by the even deeper lie of white supremacy and white nationalism. Yes, these divisions have been compounded further through the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 has been apocalyptic, particularly in the original Greek meaning of the word of apocalypse, which means to reveal, to lay bare. The COVID crisis has laid bare many of the racial fissures and inequities in our nation, and has laid bare 2 other viruses that I believe have fueled and exacerbated the COVID virus itself: the virus of systemic racism and the virus of toxic polarization. COVID provides us with an impetus, an imperative to deal more boldly and directly with these other viruses. Because if we do, we can come out of this COVID wilderness and exile experience, having achieved what my friend Sean Barney refers to as a hard reset, a reset of our economic life, our political life, our social life, in ways that lead to a radically more just and inclusive multiracial democracy. Yes, we can't go back to the broken old normal of deep racial inequity and crippling polarization. We have an opportunity, I would even say a responsibility, to come out of this crisis and spark what Dr. Eddie Glaude calls a third founding, or what Reverend William Barber III calls a third reconstruction of our nation, where we together build a nation in which we finally cast out the belief that some lives are worth more than others, and that some Americans are more American than others, where we embrace a much more inclusive we the people and make the American creed of liberty and justice for all truly a reality for all Americans, where we embrace our increasing racial and cultural and religious diversity as a strength and not as a weakness, as an asset and not as a threat. Crises like COVID have the power and potential to bring out our best angels, but we've also seen the ways in which it has brought out our worst demons. It has brought many of us closer together, but it has also exacerbated many of our deepest divisions. Crises can affirm our common humanity or lead us to deny that same common humanity. An organization called More in Common, in a recent report and study called American Fabric, captured our current situation quite well. They say, entrenched polarization has left us feeling that we share less in common with each other, and that ever more parts of our national fabric are stretched and worn thin. After a pandemic, a historic movement against police brutality, and a contentious presidential election, the country feels exhausted. not least because each event appeared to inflame rather than abate existing political conflict. I believe, my brothers and sisters, that we are at an inflection point in our nation's history and in our nation's politics, where we face an essential choice between a politics of division and what I refer to as a politics of the common good. The politics of division trades in fear, hatred, and hypocrisy, what the theologian and mystic Howard Thurman referred to as the 3 hounds of hell that track the disinherited. The politics of division stokes an us versus them and zero-sum mentality. It reasserts the lie that some Americans are worth more than others, and is so often fueled by falsehoods, hyper-selfishness, and efforts to erode public trust in institutions and the media. It feeds on what political scientists refer to as affective polarization, which is a form of polarization that is tied to core parts of our identity and makes us see the world in an us versus them way, tied to the groups that we feel a part of. It is a politics that is so often fueled by grievance and a feeling of missing out or being left behind. But I believe that there is another kind of politics that is tied to a greater commitment to understanding that we are truly in this together. A politics that seeks to find common ground and the common good. A politics that helps to prioritize the welfare and the needs of the most vulnerable and the most marginalized. Just to give you a sense of just how polarized our nation has become, a recent Pew report based on nearly 10,000 interviews found that overwhelming majorities in both political parties say the extent of polarization is growing worse, and half of them say this is a cause for concern. 55% of Republicans say Democrats are more immoral when compared to other Americans, while 7% of Democrats say the same thing about Republicans. And majorities in both parties say those in the opposing party do not share their non-political values and goals. We have reached a dangerous state in our politics, in our country, where we're not as much differing over issues. We are literally differing over a sense of who belongs and who deserves to have certain access to power or to stay in power. We've reached a point where not only do many dislike the other side, they have come to hate the other side. Yes, the virus of toxic polarization is a real and present danger to the beloved community itself. But there's another virus that I mentioned earlier, the virus of systemic racism that has been with our nation since its inception, which also poses an imminent threat, an ongoing threat to the beloved community. It is a challenge that has disfigured our democracy and betrayed our nation's promise since the beginning of our nation. Racism is not simply interpersonal or about offensive slurs or statements. It has become ingrained in the very air we breathe. It's ingrained in our culture, our institutions, and our policies in ways that continue to cause harm and disadvantage people of color, including and particularly Black Americans. The racial awakening and reckoning that took place over the summer after the senseless and brutal killings of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others sparked a hopeful wave of largely peaceful protests across the country, demanding for a transformation in policing and demanding for major progress in addressing systemic racism. But the question before us is whether this was truly an awakening and to what degree it has actually led to a reckoning. I would argue that it has been a partial awakening among some corners of America, but it has not penetrated nearly far enough. And that it won't become a reckoning until we see significant policy and structural change that helps to transform our nation's politics and economics. Sadly, a survey by a polling group called PRRI found that even after the summer, approximately 8 in 10 Republicans and 7 in 10 white evangelical Protestants continue to say that the recent killings of Black men by police are isolated incidents rather than a part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans. And these views have not changed since PRI began asking this question in 2015. Again, remember our challenge of pathological individualism. So many of us see issues of injustice, including in policing, only as isolated incidents without understanding the way in which that is tied into both a long history and into structures and systems that so often impact an entire group of people, viewing them as a threat rather than as being innocent, criminalizing Black bodies and Black lives, and so much more. Of course, there's no magic bullet or single cure for the virus of systemic racism and toxic fluoridation. But I believe that our faith traditions provide timeless wisdom that can and must be used to combat and even cure these viruses, and that a shared moral vision for our country could be one of the most powerful antidotes. I've become convinced that part of the reason our country is so divided is that we have such conflicting and competing understandings of our own history, and that we lack a shared moral vision about who we are and where we want to go as a nation. Now, I'm not naive. I don't believe necessarily that every American is going to latch on to the exact same moral vision. But I do believe that if we were to cast a moral vision that is aligned with the vision of the beloved community, that it would resonate with the vast majority of Americans and unite us across many of the differences and divisions that are currently tearing us apart. The reason why a moral vision, a shared moral vision or narrative is so important is that how we make sense of ourselves and the world around us is so often through what is often described as stories or public narrative. Stories have the ability to mislead and deceive us, or of shedding light and truth and unifying us. While a great deal binds us together, there are powerful forces, some of which I've named, that are tearing our nation apart. And without a shared sense of our common destiny and our common journey together, I believe that we are much more susceptible to the politics of fear and division that can so easily take us on the wrong path. It is important that we replace distorted and destructive narratives with much more hopeful and transformative ones. And while this may sound like a partisan statement, I don't intend it to be one. But I believe, as a prime example, that the political slogan and narrative, if you will, of Make America Great Again, while it was an effective political strategy, it was a deeply problematic one because it helped to exacerbate so many of the divisions in our country. It tapped into a kind of false sense of American exceptionalism. It exacerbated America's amnesia about so many parts of its history. And at worst, it tapped into a kind of white supremacist mentality that sounded like a dog whistle for making America white again. I, in contrast, believe that a reimagined understanding of the beloved community would provide that moral vision that could unite us across so many differences. When I look back over the course of American history, there isn't a moral vision that has been more compelling and I think been more transformational. The beloved community literally was the vision that helped to root and to animate the civil rights struggle. The beloved community itself was originally coined in the early days of the 20th century by the philosopher and theologian Josiah Royce, who started using the term, but later it became picked up and popularized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a member of that same organization called the Fellowship of Reconciliation. This pursuit of an expanded and reimagined vision of the beloved community combines both civic humanitarianism with a deep spiritual and religious set of values. My own most simple definition of the beloved community is one in which neither punishment nor privilege is tied any longer to race, to ethnicity, to sexual identity, to sexuality, to ableness, and to so many other things that define us. And when you think about this, it really is a very high bar. If we were to ensure that punishment no longer is tied to race and skin color and ethnicity, we would transform our criminal justice system. If we were committed to ensuring that privilege is no longer tied to race and ethnicity and gender, we would transform our economics and have to make radical changes that make the playing field more equal, but also make amends for some of the injustices that continue to show up in the present. But in addition to this kind of definition of the beloved community, I believe that we have to emphasize the importance and power of the words beloved. That in that word, there is an understanding that our lives are truly interconnected. It is tied to a commitment that I often describe as Ubuntu Interdependence. It is an understanding that I am because we are. It is an enhanced understanding of the golden rule, drawing from my own faith tradition. And that is a critical way that we can counteract so much of the hyper-selflessness and the rugged individualism that so often push us in a different direction. I want to close very quickly with what I describe as 5 smooth stones for realizing the beloved community. Some of you hopefully know and will remember the story of David and Goliath, and it's not a story that I'll retell in its entirety. But in this story, a young shepherd boy named David has the courage to take on the mighty Philistine Goliath in battle. And initially, King Saul gives him a sword and armor, and David realizes that these conventional tools are going to be useless to him. And so he reconfigures the battlefield according to his sanctified imagination. And he remembers how God enabled him to overcome a lion and a bear with a slingshot. And so he finds 5 smooth stones in a brook, and he uses one of those stones to knock down the mighty Philistine and ultimately to cut off his head. Well, I mentioned that story because in the context of building the beloved community, I think it's essential that we identify those spiritual and faith-centered stones that I believe can be game changers in the context of building a radically more just nation and world. And I believe that we can't always simply just pick up use the same tools that are used in other settings. And I believe that there are kind of 5 keystones that are essential for this ongoing journey of building the beloved community. The first one is the importance and power of truth-telling. Jesus said it best, that you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. James Baldwin, the great author and activist, once said that those who refuse to acknowledge their history will remain captive within it. The reason why I'm starting with truth-telling is I believe it's so critical for our nation in the context of this reckoning moment to have a more holistic understanding of our history and to be willing to do some of the hard truth-telling about how so much of the injustice of the past continues to show up in the present. That you can't understand the horrific murder of George Floyd and his current trial, or the current trial of Officer Derek Chauvin, without understanding the origins of policing itself, without understanding the ways in which slavery that morphed into a system of Jim Crow segregation that has now morphed into more subtle and sophisticated forms of injustice, helped to contribute to the current crisis that we face when it comes to racialized policing. There's a current effort underway that Sojourners is a part of to try to push the Biden administration, both through legislation, but also through an executive order, to create a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission that would do the work of acknowledging, memorializing, and engaging our nation in some of these hard conversations about our history, particularly the history of slavery, and how it continues to impact and influence present-day history in ways that can be a catalyst for progress in jettisoning the belief in the hierarchy of human value so that we can embrace our common humanity and permanently eliminate persistent racial inequities. We are a part of a broader coalition that is working to try to ensure that this kind of commission can happen, because there can't be lasting and true healing and reconciliation without a greater commitment to truth-telling and a greater commitment to justice, which will even require some important and hard conversations about reparations and what making amends should look like. And we can certainly dwell on that more during the Q&A time. The second smooth stone is what I refer to as pragmatic solidarity. Dr. King famously said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And this quote is critical because it reminds us again that our lives are intertwined. I learned a lot from some of the time I spent with Dr. Paul Farmer and Dr. Jim Kim, who co-founded an organization called Partners in Health. They worked in some of the poorest parts of the world to try to bring a preferential option to the poor to healthcare. They were early pioneers in ensuring that AIDS treatment was provided to some of the poorest people in Haiti back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Dr. Farmer describes pragmatic solidarity as both the desire to make common cause with those in need and the willingness to provide goods and services to diminish their hardship and to address the root causes of their hardship. I believe that we need pragmatic solidarity in the context of many of the challenges we face today, whether that's the assault on voting rights that we are seeing happen all across the country, with over 350 bills that would further restrict the right to vote having been proposed in over 47 states across the country since the 2020 election. As pragmatic solidarity is a critical way in which we find common cause with those who are disinherited, for those that have been marginalized, and those that are oppressed. A close cousin to pragmatic solidarity is one that I mentioned earlier, which is what I call Ubuntu Interdependence. Again, it's understanding that our lives are truly interconnected. I had the privilege of studying abroad in South Africa in 1996, and I learned about not only the concept of Ubuntu, of I am but we are, but I learned some Zulu. I've forgotten most of it, but one of the sayings that really stuck in my mind is a Zulu greeting that says "Sawubona," which means I see you. And the response is "Siyakona," which means I am here. It is based on a belief that until you fully see me and you see my humanity, then I cannot be fully seen. In other words, our liberation, our wholeness is tied into one another's. It echoes the call and the mandate of the prophet Isaiah in the 59th chapter of Isaiah, where he describes the kind of religious worship that pleases God. And he says, when we engage in acts of service, of feeding the hungry, and when we break the yokes of injustice, in other words, when we address the root cause of injustice, then our light will shine like a noonday. We will be called repairers of the breach, restorers of streets with dwellings. He is describing how our liberation is intertwined with the liberation of others, and that we can only be made whole through the wholeness of others. I believe that the COVID pandemic was a fundamental test of Ubuntu interdependence. And sadly, in many respects, major parts of America failed, from the political leadership level, particularly within the Trump administration, all the way down to the individual level. How is it that a simple act of wearing a mask and now of taking a vaccine once you have access have become partisanized and politicized to the point where 50% of Republican men are now saying in polls that they will not get a vaccine, which could literally jeopardize our ability to reach herd immunity and ultimately conquer COVID? In my estimation, the willingness and commitment to wearing a mask and getting a vaccine is one of the most powerful ways that we can show Ubuntu. We can live into the golden rule. We can love ourselves and love our neighbors. Fourth, building the beloved community will require a greater commitment to sacrifice. Sacrifice comes from the Latin word passion, which means to suffer or sacrifice. We certainly saw that in Dr. King's ministry, and we understand that so often justice requires us to be willing to break out of our comfort zones, to be willing to engage in activity and in actions that may not always be easy or comfortable. I can't count the number of protests that I've been a part of, and certainly protest is not the only expression of sacrifice or of activism, but it's a very critical one. And I have seen through my own activism just how impactful simple things like writing a letter to a member of Congress, or making a phone call, or writing an op-ed in a local newspaper can have a ripple effect in creating very significant change. Lastly, building the beloved community requires what I call steadfast love, or in the words of King, agape love. Dr. King, at the end of the Montgomery bus boycott, said, "The end is reconciliation, the end is redemption, the end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this type of goodwill that can transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age." I'm amazed that through all Dr. King went through, death threats and imprisonments, he never lost his passion and commitment to loving even his enemies. It is certainly the call that is central to the Christian faith, to love our enemies, which is an extremely tall order, particularly in our current culture and politics, but is one that we need to model much more of. We need to exhibit a kind of agape love, a sacrificial love that ultimately can help transform enemies into friends, that can transform the other into our neighbor. I want to close with a quick movie reference. I'm a big movie buff, and within my household, we are diehard Marvel fans. One of the gifts of the pandemic, I was always kind of looking for silver linings, is that we, as a family, watched every single Marvel movie. I have an 8 and 10-year-old son, by the way, from the first all the way through the last. And still, yet my hands down favorite of all Marvel movies, maybe even movies of all time, is the movie Black Panther. I believe that it was a movie ahead of its time and was a game changer in the Marvel series. Now, if you haven't seen the movie, I'm not going to shame you. I hope that you will see it as soon as possible. But just to give you a little context, in the movie, which takes place in the African country of Wakanda, Wakanda is able to leapfrog the rest of the world in its military and technological advancement due to their possession of a rare metal called vibranium. Vibranium also gives the Wakandans superhuman intelligence and strength. And I believe that what vibranium does for Wakanda, our spirituality, our faith can do for the changes that need to happen in our country and our world. It provides what I refer to as our spiritual vibranium that so often sustains and strengthens the work of building the beloved community. Because the journey of justice, the journey of building the beloved community is a long and arduous one that requires perseverance and fortitude, something that we can find in the spiritual vibranium from our faith and spirituality. At the end of the movie, King T'Challa realizes that vibranium is not meant only to serve and protect the people of Wakanda. No, vibranium is meant to protect and liberate the entire world. And that is what I believe so strongly about our faith and our spirituality, that again, it is not a private possession. It is meant to help enlist us in the causes of justice and of building the beloved community in the world around us. I believe that the beloved community does require a hard reset. It may even require a third founding or a third reconstruction of our nation. And this work is not inevitable. It will require all of us to engage in this work together to combat the viruses of systemic racism and toxic polarization, which represent both an imperative and a test of our faith and our spirituality. We will see an end to this COVID crisis, but let's do it in a way that remakes and transforms Boston and our nation into places in which liberty and justice for all are not simply an aspirational ideal, but become a reality for all. Let's do it in a way that builds the beloved community. I hope and pray in your college career and beyond it, that you will embrace a commitment to pragmatic solidarity, to Ubuntu Interdependence, that you will be willing to sacrifice on behalf of justice, that you will seek out and speak the truth, that you will exhibit steadfast love as together we build a beloved community. So Tufts students and alumni and friends, now is a time to tap into some spiritual vibranium. Now is a time to replace a broken and bankrupt moral vision with a more hopeful and unifying one. Now is the time to build the beloved community. Amen.
Thank you so much, Reverend Taylor. My name is Neha Ratnapuri, and I use the she series pronouns. I'm a sophomore studying psychology and civic studies, and I'm active in the Buddhist Mindfulness Sangha, the Hindu Student Council, and the Interfaith Student Council. I'm also a co-planner for the upcoming Interfaith Leadership Workshop on housing justice.
And my name is John Lazur. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a junior studying anthropology. I'm also a member of the humanist community at Tufts, the Unitarian Universalist student community, and the Interfaith Student Council. I am also a student worker at the University Chaplaincy, and I'm preparing for some independent research centered on multi-faith spaces on campus. We are so happy that you were able to join us tonight, Reverend Taylor. And we'd like to kick off this time for Q&A and conversation with some questions that we've prepared of ourselves. And then Elyse, the university chaplain, will join us to moderate some questions from the audience. So while we ask some questions of Reverend Taylor, we invite people to submit their questions via the Q&A feature.
So the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected poor, queer, and BIPOC communities, and the pandemic has both illuminated and perpetuated those inequities. As we seek to heal and build a radically more just and inclusive nation, how do we create and sustain spaces for grief, lament, and healing that center the voices of those disproportionately affected? And how does your faith inform how you think about this?
Thank you. That's a great first question and a really important one. I think one of the real tragedies, it's almost like a tragedy upon a tragedy within the COVID crisis and pandemic, is that we have not created the space for more communal forms of lament and grief and of really memorializing those who have been lost. I've been grateful that the new administration has been more willing to do this publicly. It was a part of the inauguration, and there was another kind of memorial that was done soon after. But we went through the first year almost of this pandemic without anything from kind of a high level political level that enabled people that space and created that opportunity for that lament to happen. Now, clearly it's been happening at an individual level, but because of social distancing requirements, so many people were not able to have the kind of funerals that would be typical. And certainly virtual funerals are important, but are not a substitute. And so, I think that we really need to wrestle with how do we both create more of that space and more of that commitment to memorialize, to remember. It's hard to do that when you're still in the middle of the struggle, and I think we're still kind of in the heart of it. We are at an inflection point, thankfully, because of the advent of vaccines. But one of the real challenges we've seen, and this kind of ties into the themes of the talk I just gave, that inequality and injustice have a way of reproducing themselves, right? And so, not surprisingly, in the context of vaccine distribution, we have seen communities of color in particular not receive the vaccine in the same proportions as white communities and more privileged communities. And so we've got to work harder to try to change that. In the context of the faith community, there's an initiative that I'm a part of called Face for Vaccines. It's a multi-faith initiative that's bringing together Muslim leaders and Jewish leaders and Christian leaders and others to kind of work together to try to address racial disparities in vaccine distribution and to really try to convince people of all stripes, but particularly communities of color, that taking the vaccine is safe and that it is a critical way that we love and protect ourselves and others. And we've got an initiative within that called Pastors for Vaccines, where we're encouraging pastors to both preach and teach about the importance of getting the vaccine, particularly as a golden rule commitment, but also to take a video of it, or at least a photo of them getting the vaccine, and then sharing that across their social media channels. And it's a kind of a pretty important and effective way to try to break through some of the suspicion and distrust that still exists toward the vaccine itself. I think from a kind of public policy commitment at every level, from local level all the way up to the federal level, we need to use COVID as a gigantic case study of what is wrong with our health system and what is often wrong with our economy itself. And while we're not going to be able to change things overnight, I really hope that there's kind of a serious re-examination of how we need to do things very differently and build very different policies and commitments and priorities so that we don't have the same, recreation of a lot of the inequalities that have been with us for far too long.
Thank you. I think really digging into one part of that you're bringing up of the role of faith communities. In your inauguration day column on Sojourners earlier this year, you wrote, "I believe fervently in the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said that the church is not to be called the master or servant of the state, but to be the conscience of the state. In that vein, we will be neither chaplain nor sycophant to our new political leaders. Instead, we seek to be a faithful conscience, serving as a bridge builder and offering prophetic critique and pressure when necessary." What does it mean for us to be a faithful conscience, to be faithful consciences as communities and as individuals, especially in this time, as you're mentioning, of extreme political polarization, where discourse often falls into binaries of good and evil and right and wrong? and also situations where seeking middle ground is often insufficient for liberation and for the building of a beloved community. And I might add, what does conscience look like for an interfaith community as we seek to build that?
Yeah, John, that's a brilliant question. And I feel like I need another 45-minute lecture to give it justice, but I'll do my best. So yeah, I love that quote by King. I think it also applies not just to churches, but to synagogues and the mosques as well. Pretty much any religious institution or spiritual institution. Our role at its best is not to, become, as King mentioned so aptly, the master of the servant of the state, but to become the conscience of the state. So what that means to me is that, we need to have the independence from our political parties and our political systems. That doesn't mean that some of us aren't active members in a political party, but that shouldn't be, from a faith perspective, our primary identity and allegiance. My primary allegiance is not to the Republican Party, the Democratic Party. My primary allegiance is my understanding of what it means to follow Christ. And that should really shake up both political parties in lots of different ways. And it really should influence and over time change some of the priorities that they may have. One example of that is, while I'm not in any way trying to say both parties have been the same on this agenda, but neither party has really prioritized enough lifting people out of poverty and protecting the most vulnerable in our midst. Certainly, I think there's been a lot more progress under the Biden administration, and we've seen a lot of encouraging signs through the rescue package and beyond. But the poor have often been kind of invisible in our political debates and have often, certainly not been a political priority. And so the faith community should be the first to come alongside those who are living in poverty and make sure that their voices are heard, that their needs are heard, and really, try to ensure that their welfare and their well-being is prioritized within our political system. So that, that's not, again, like a partisan issue, that is a faith issue. I think there's lots of examples like that. That the challenge in part is that politics is a messy process. It's in some cases the art of compromise. It's about power. I think unfortunately it's become too much about power. And I talked about how we've become kind of stuck in a zero-sum, winner-take-all, kind of us versus them form of politics. But I think in part that's because we, particularly those that are in the faith community, are not demanding that our politics is able and willing to try to seek common ground, try to find better solutions, not get so stuck in ideological disagreements as much as, some of those matter. But, again, we shouldn't be led by ideology. We should be led by ultimately what is going to make the most difference and have the most impact in creating the kind of society that we want to create. And so, for me, being the conscience of the state is literally willing to criticize those in my in-group that may end up supporting things that I think are contrary to the values and the priorities of my faith tradition. It means, not just being a cheerleader for the Biden administration, as much as I do think they've made a lot of great steps, particularly in the fight against COVID, but to hold them accountable to doing more. And in this case, I've been doing a lot of work as a prime example to try to convince them to allow houses of worship to become vaccination centers, because I think that'll really improve the uptake of vaccines, particularly in marginalized communities, and really trying to hold them accountable to making more progress in ensuring there's equity when it comes to vaccine distribution. So that's kind of a piece of it. And I guess the last thing I would emphasize is that, so many of our social movements have been fueled by and rooted in faith and spirituality. Talk the most about the civil rights movement, but that's actually true of the early days of the environmental movement in this country. That's true of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. That was true in the women's movement in lots of different respects. So again, it's not to say that it was only people of faith that were involved in leading it, but faith did provide this catalyst that I think is just so powerful. And I want to see more of that in the future.
Thank you. In our Interfaith Student Council, we've talked about our different roles according to Deepa Iyer's social change ecosystem, which includes being a builder, caregiver, healer, etc. It also includes being a disruptor, which sounds something like offering prophetic critique and pressure. How do you think we as students can create genuine space for interfaith disruptors to shake up the status quo and raise awareness about the justice issues in our communities?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think I love that word disrupt. I think it's a really important ethic, if you will. And again, I've long believed that students are some of the best disruptors out there. And so I really encourage you to continue to be a disruptor of injustice. I think some of the pitfalls are that I told the story of David and Goliath for a reason, because oftentimes many causes of injustice can feel like a modern day Goliath. They make us feel overwhelmed. They can seem invincible. And so the student level in particular, you kind of grapple with, where do you start? If I care about trying to change and transform a criminal justice system, that's such a huge challenge. And where do you start, right? So I think part of it is really figuring out where you can make the most impact, and that might certainly be in concert with, or kind of working in and through another organization or coalition of organizations. And then figuring out how do you, this is kind of a term that's used in organizing circles, but how do you cut the diamond of an issue so that you can cut it in the right way that enables you to be able to make an impact and hopefully achieve some kind of real policy change, which then helps you to build a greater sense of your own agency and power, and will enable you to then address a bigger slice of that diamond in the future. I'll give you an example. So when I talked a little bit about some of my experience in the early days of the AIDS movement, and when I came back from my time in South Africa and Zambia, I was really just filled with moral indignation about the lack of leadership from the United States in addressing the global AIDS pandemic. And so, I was faced with this kind of gigantic problem, and really believed that students, if they were awakened to this crisis, could really make a big difference. And so we ended up starting these college campus chapters around the country that ultimately became the Student Global AIDS Campaign. There actually was a Student Global AIDS Campaign at Tufts University way back in the day. Don't know what happened to it, but in any case, we got students involved in writing letters to their members of Congress and making phone calls to their members of Congress, and then ultimately organized some lobby visits in Washington, where we brought students in from around the country to try to pressure members of Congress to try to ensure that the United States would start giving billions of dollars in the fight against global AIDS instead of millions of dollars. What was amazing is that many members of Congress just had not really heard about the crisis. They didn't know the scale of it, and they never heard a constituent that came to them and kind of made a moral case for them to do more. And we were able to convince quite a few members on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, to support initially a commitment for the United States to help create what's called the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. And then ultimately, in concert with many others, we worked with the ACT UP and many parts of the kind of AIDS activist community, but many other organizations too, worked in concert to pressure the Bush administration to make a major commitment to fight AIDS in Africa. And that ultimately became PEPFAR, the President's Emergency AIDS Plan, which literally helped to put 11 million people over the course of 5 years on antiretroviral therapy, and really helped to turn the tide of the global AIDS pandemic. I think it's one of the brightest achievements of US foreign policy in a very long time, if not in our history. And it really is a crowning achievement of the Bush administration. And that happened in part because a lot of young people and a lot of students wrote letters, made phone calls, and went to go visit their members of Congress. And so, it doesn't take rocket science. It does take a commitment. It does take some sacrifice, but even those kind of actions can add up to a pretty significant impact.
Reverend Taylor, we only have a few minutes left, but I want to bring a question from the audience to you. And it's this: what do you say to inspire anti-racist students who do not have a faith-based belief?
I would say that I love and admire your commitment to anti-racism, and being anti-racist does not require being connected to a faith tradition, and that there is so much work that we have to do in the context of rooting out racism, rooting out white supremacy, that has to be done from lots of different vantage points. And so, while I do think there's real importance and power in tapping into different faith traditions, so I didn't talk about this much in my talk, but the notion in Christianity, the commitment to Namaga Dei, the notion and belief that we are made in the very image and likeness of God, it's just such a powerful core belief of Christianity. And to me, it's one of the most powerful antidotes to racism, because you can't believe that we're made in the image of God and then believe that some people are worth more than others because of their skin color or because of their race. And so, yes, we should tap into that, but there are lots of humanist and secular arguments and reasons why we should also be committed to anti-racism. And Christianity certainly doesn't have a monopoly on that.
Thank you. We have more questions that we would love to ask, and we're not going to have time for all of them, but I want to give John a quick opportunity to answer to ask his final question, and then we will move to parting words from our humanist chaplain, Walker Bristol.
Yeah, I think I would really love to just continue this thought of what students can do and where these conversations emerge on campus. And one of the conversations that we're having right now at Tufts has to do with public safety and has to do with the Tufts University Police Department. And in one of your articles addressing public safety, you call for reimagining public safety and reimagining it through investment in education and health and community-based initiatives. And I wonder how you might elaborate that connection between that work and what it means to become beloved community, what it means to work towards beloved community together. And also, what sort of creative, courageous action does it take to do that at a college campus, perhaps at Tufts?
Yeah, that's a great closing question. And I do regret that I, kind of ran out of time and didn't able to address all of your questions. One of the casualties, occupational casualties of being a Black Baptist preacher is you can easily go over your time. But maybe there's some other ways that I can respond to those other questions. So really quickly, there was I should mention that I've been laboring over a second book, which I'm excited is now done and will come out in September, that is entitled A More Perfect Union, A New Vision for Building the Beloved Community. And so please look out for that, and if you're interested, would love to have you check it out and read it. But one of the stories I tell in that book is from my time at Emory, actually. We don't have time for me to tell the whole story, but basically there was a crisis that erupted on campus because a Black woman was assaulted by a white male student who kind of got involved in an argument between a white female and a Black female student. And so the white male ended up assaulting the Black female, and then later that evening, 4 Black male students ended up visiting the white male student and kind of said, if this was a different time, you'd be a dead man. Didn't lay a hand on him, but threatened his life. And because of threats that were made during the civil rights movement on many civil rights leaders, the state of Georgia ended up making a threat on someone's life a felony. And so these 4 Black male students were charged with a felony crime and were rounded up and brought to the police station while the white male student was kind of walking scot-free. And so it created, this huge controversy and crisis, and it kind of was the last straw in a sense, because there had been a lot of frustration among Black students, including myself, who had seen this pattern of kind of misuse and abuse of authority by the Emory Police Department, constantly stopping students and asking for your ID, and also just challenges within the administration around a number of different issues. And so I was able to play a role with another professor to kind of break a stalemate between many of the Black student-led organizations and the administration to really try to start having a dialogue about what kind of systemic solutions we could come up to that would really help to transform and repair policing at Emory, but also in a larger sense, address broader racial justice issues. And so, I don't know the situation well enough at Tufts to be able to kind of give you prescriptions on what should or shouldn't happen. But I do think this is a moment where, if it hasn't happened already, there should be, some clear process to be able to unearth and investigate if there is a pattern of discrimination or abuse in policing on Tufts campus. And if so, if it's found that that has happened and is happening, what is going to be done to rectify that? And I think that at the very least is kind of a starting point, and that would likely open up a lot of other issues that also need to be addressed. There's a much broader set of issues that we need to be addressing in policing. And, I think there's so much more to say here, but one of the things that sometimes happens in social movements is, people that are pushing for things often get caricatured and, misunderstood. So even in the context of the kind of mantra to defund the police, which has been fairly controversial in the larger police debate in this country, the way that I understand that, and the way that many of the people that I'm in a relationship who are on the ground in the Black Lives Matter movement have defined it, is they are saying that we need to reinvest from broken policing and things that are counterproductive to things that we actually know are going to make communities more safe. And we have centered the police in public safety way too much. Yes, police are important, but they are not the totality of what makes communities safe. And because of a lack of accountability with the abuse of policing and of racialized policing, we have police that are often doing a great deal of harm, particularly toward communities of color. And so I do think this is a moment where we really do have to reimagine what public safety looks like more broadly and holistically. And it will require a lot of reforms to policing itself, but also real shifts in investment from things that are not working and are counterproductive in our current policing system to things that actually would build much more healthy and thriving communities.
Thank you, John and Neha, and thank you, Reverend Taylor, for being with us. I want to pass it on now to Humanist Chaplain Walker Bristol.
Thank you, Elyse, and thank you very much, Reverend Taylor, for sharing the call you've given us to carry the unfinished business of this struggle for racial justice and transformation today. Thank you. Every year as we hold this lecture, I hear from our students how it unexpectedly impacts their ideas of vocation and calling as they go on to their future careers. In 2017, Reverend Sekou spoke to us and guided a student to prophetic documentary filmmaking. Some years before that, Reverend Dr. Gloria White Hammond inspired several of our students to incorporate a ministry of healing into their medical practice. And I'm certain this year will be no different. I'm excited to hear from members of our community in the days to come the new directions that your lecture, Reverend Taylor, will inspire here. Everyone, as we leave today, accompanying Reverend Taylor's call, I invite us all to keep history alive among us, the history that lives within us and around us, celebrating the histories of resilience and transformation, but also telling the truth about the storied histories of violence and of slavery that are beneath so much of what we've created in this nation in particular. As a civil rights organizer, Bayard Rustin called on us to be afraid is to behave as if the truth is not true. So shall we act truthfully without fear together now. This historical moment, of course, is still a time of uncertainty and a time when community can be difficult to see before us. But it is also a moment filled with the stories that we haven't heard or listened to before in America. We have an extraordinary opportunity through coming into a relationship and into deeper and beloved community to give those stories the life they deserve and to make healing possible. An opportunity where not only the traumas of our society, the traumas the society has enacted upon so many in this country can be made known, but that the celebrations of all our truest selves and our communities and our ancestors and our dreams can be known also and made known fearlessly. And I believe in that future, and it's a privilege to be here in collaboration at Tufts and beyond with so many who believe that also. And I'm very grateful to Reverend Taylor and to you all for joining in that today and imagining what we might create together tomorrow. So thank you and best wishes. And from the chaplaincy, may we all find peace and strength and light in that shared journey to come. Thank you.